I am going. I am going to go ahead and kick us off here so that we can devote as much time as possible to Mei, because I know she has a lot of valuable insight to share with us. Welcome again to everyone. My name is Henry Joe. I am a member of the Birmingham Committee on Foreign Relations. For those of you who may be new, the BCFR, Birmingham Committee on Foreign Relations, is a foreign policy study group in Birmingham, Alabama. Our mission is really to bring the world to Birmingham and in turn to showcase the city of Birmingham to our guests and to the world, to engage young people in foreign policy. We are a 501c3 organization. We were founded in 1943 and we are affiliated with the American Committees on Foreign Relations. We're actually one of the largest and oldest affiliate organizations of the American Committees on Foreign Relations. We're also, as it pertains to tonight, a partner organization with the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. So again, welcome to everyone. I'll share the website in the chat. Please come check us out. If you're in Birmingham, we'd love to see you at our in-person events. We're having a mix of in-person and remote events right now. So with that, just a couple of housekeeping items about tonight. I'm going to say a few words and then shut up so that we can get to Mei. But we're going to spend about an hour with Mei, and we will try to have some time for questions at the end. I'm sure there will be some great ones. We'll take a quick break so that everybody can run and refill their glass of wine, run to the restroom if they need to, and then at 6 o'clock Central Time, we'll turn it over to Fareed Zakaria. So that's going to be on a separate live stream. I'm going to share that live stream here, so you don't necessarily need to drop off this. But in case you do, I'm also going to drop a link to that in the chat as well. So please don't hesitate to drop your questions in the chat. Once Mei finishes her remarks, I'll sort of manage the Q&A session so that she can focus on answering your questions. So a few words about our speaker, our first speaker this evening. She is a leading policy expert on China. She is an accomplished journalist. She won a Pulitzer Prize for international reporting in 2007. Education, National University of Singapore, master's at Columbia. She was named to the Foreign Policy's U.S.-China Top 50 list in 2017. She has a Wikipedia page, so I'm not going to go through the whole page because it would take the full hour, but just some of the high points to demonstrate that our speaker tonight knows her stuff. So with that, thank you all so much for joining, and Mei, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Henry. And thanks to all of you at Birmingham for inviting me over. I've always wanted to come, by the way, I should say this. I've been very interested in the civil rights movement in Birmingham for a long time. And so I would very much love to wish that we could have done this in person. But as it is, here we are. And I'm still welcoming and glad for the opportunity to do so. By the way, Henry mentioned that I have a Wikipedia page. I was going to say, please disregard the photo on it. It was not my most flattering moment. Wikipedia is run by volunteer people, so they put whatever is up there. So I don't have a control over it, and my hair looks wild in it. Anyway, brief moment of vanity aside, I gave a lot of thought to how I could frame this talk about China and human rights issues. And, there were so many directions that this could go in. And the way I thought it best to talk about this was in the light of a story and frame it in the light of my experiences and how I came to look at the human rights issues, particularly in China. And to me, it starts and sort of its book ended in a part in symmetry by the 2008 Olympics, and now the upcoming Olympics that is once again coming to China very soon in February 4th. So the 2008 Olympics was actually when I sort of had my first sort of big Olympics coverage. And when I was working in China for the Wall Street Journal. And part of the reason I was in Beijing was to cover the Olympics in 2008. And it wasn't because I was interested in sports. In fact, I know very little about sports. I still am not a big sports fan. The idea was the Olympics was a wonderful way to sort of look at a lot of issues on how China was changing and growing. This was seen as a big business story, which is very important to my paper, The Wall Street Journal, as an economics, business economy story. There were many multiple huge corporations that see the Olympics as a major opportunity, particularly for a country like China, which in 2008 was, the economy was growing by huge leaps and bounds. You have your biggest, largest billion, size strong economy of people who were just getting introduced to the so-called global brand. So, this was seen as a wonderful business opportunity for them. And for China itself, it was also seen as a coming out party. That was really how they viewed it as China. This was a moment that after about a century of humiliation, as the Chinese considered themselves, they were finally getting on an ascendant stage. And this was really the big, big opportunity to mark that. They were going from counting backwards from the Opium War, and then after that, all the huge, civil war between the nationalists and the Communist Party, and so many horrible things that happened, the Great Leap Forward, famine, starvation. This was the first time in about 20, 30 years, and China's economy was growing, and this was going to be the big coming out party. That was how it was seen. So it was terrific excitement about it. And so I was sent to write about this all using this framework very loosely. And it was a wonderful opportunity for me. And so when I looked back at that period in time, for me, even though this was a business story, it was also, to me, one of the most interesting stories was how lives were changing in China very rapidly. And so one of the stories that I wrote at that time that formed part of the Pulitzer Prize winning package that my colleagues and I won that year was about the Olympics. Specifically, it was about how the Olympics had led to this huge building boom in Beijing. And, there were like huge, massive infrastructure projects at the time. There was a subway that was going to be way bigger than the London subway, 3 times over. There was going to be massive buildings that went up at the speed of light. You saw all these wonderful, architectural issues. Like if you've seen the Underpants Tower, as they call it, it's this shaped tower like that, or the Bird's Nest Stadium, or any number of things. And these were all coming up like very rapidly. And so I was very interested in that story, but I was also particularly interested in who was building all these buildings, because we didn't see them. You had these huge billboards. There was a whole army of migrant workers that were coming from all other parts of China to build these, to participate in the big Olympics building boom. And I was interested in their lives, and I was interested in how they were doing to build this, this invisible army. I wanted to make them visible. I wanted to find out more about them. And so I started going around and hanging out and figuring out ways to talk to construction workers in a meaningful way, which is not very easy for a female foreign person, and sort of get a sense of their lives and what was. And what I discovered, of course, was these were very horrible conditions for them. They were, frequently badly paid, working in very unsafe conditions. And at the same time, the issue was also a wider issue with China, not just Beijing per se, but the migrant workers that came from, all other parts outside the big cities to come and work in the factories and in the cities were very much second-class citizens, not just from a pay structure scale sense, but because of their residency status. Most of them did not possess a hukou, which is your right of residence to the city, without which you cannot obtain rights to basically really live and exist. That you can't send your children to the local schools, you can't really get medical treatment in any of the local hospitals. You're kind of underground. You cannot really live there. So you exist there for a little bit, and then you send money back to your families, perhaps, and you don't see them for years on end. So I remember spending a lot of time with a worker called Wei Zhengwen. And one of the things I thought was really interesting, he showed me, he carried a lot of keys that hung on his belt. They sort of jangle around. They look very sort of important. And I was like, wow, tell me about your keys, I said to him. And he said, well, these are keys that I pick up on the streets, and their keys, obviously, he says, oh, this is a car key, and then he didn't have a car. Oh, this is a house key. This is a key to the postal box, I think. And then it was kind of very touching and heartrending moment of how the kind of a disjunction that people have, and the things they had. And so I was going to say I had some interesting props, perhaps. And so this was a booklet that the Wall Street Journal put out to commemorate the package prize of stories that won the Pulitzer that year for us. And he is on the cover, Mr. Wei, he's here in his hard hat, and how he built, these wonderful Olympics structures that came about and sprang up around Beijing in 2008. So that was the story then. That was going to be, and when I finished writing the story, when they won the prizes, that was 2008. It was a year before the Olympics. And as everybody was sort of gearing up to this, then something else happened. Something else which really brought the issue of human rights to a forefront and really made a big question mark really on how much China was opening up. And that was the earthquake that happened in Sichuan in May of that year. There was a giant, I think 8.0 right to scale. The tremors were so strong that they could be felt all the way from Beijing to Bangkok. You could, that was how strong. And in the epicenter of the earthquake in Sichuan, buildings just crumbled and a lot of people died. Now, at the time this happened, I wasn't actually in China. I was in the borders of China. I was actually trying to go someplace else. I was trying to get into Myanmar to report on a cyclone that had happened there. But I wasn't allowed to get in there. And so I was flying back to Beijing when this earthquake happened. So when I landed, the earthquake already happened and a lot of my colleagues were already on their way to cover that. So I sat around and I started thinking, well, what is a meaningful way I can write a story? What would be interesting to think about? And then I realized, well, back to the migrant worker situation, there are a lot of migrant workers who were in Beijing who lived in Sichuan. In fact, Sichuan is a place where a lot of migrant workers come from, and they were all desperately trying to get back. They didn't no idea what happened with the earthquake to all their loved ones. And I thought, okay, what if I followed a family back, and we go back and we'll see what happens. So I went to the train station and I sort of hung around and I found another group also of construction workers, men and women, and they were all trying to get back to their hometown. They had no idea what happened. And so I followed them on a long journey back. And it took us 3-4 days because a lot of the infrastructure ripped up. So we took the trains, we took boats, we took motorcycles at one point, we walked, and they were all carrying all their belongings. And the story at the end of it all was not a happy one. Most of them went back and they discovered, a lot of their family members had died. And more to the point, many of them, they were only children, because this is what I discovered very soon after that the area where the epicenter happened had actually been a test ground for China's one-child policy. So before China had rolled out a nationwide one-child policy, they had tested it in places like Sichuan. And so as a result of that, a lot of the parents not only lost children, they lost their only child. And what was made apparent to me after that very soon was a lot of them were rushing to hospitals within days or weeks of the earthquake. And this was to reverse the sterilizations and the vasectomies they'd been forced to have as part of the one-child policy, because they knew now that they had lost their only child. And for some of them, they were like, okay, we are desperate to have another one because this is our only shot. And we are getting too old. And even though we truly mourn our one child that has been lost, we realize that we cannot we have this window. So there was this act of very sad desperation on top of the desolation that the earthquake had caused. Now, how did this relate to the Olympics, you might ask? Well, that was when I really start to see, that what was opening up was actually not the case, because despite the heartbreak, despite the real grievances that many parents had, many of them had real questions about why a lot of the children died in what they used to call tofu schools, because the schools were badly built and many of them just crumbled when other, government buildings were more sturdy, stood next to them. So there was a lot of outcry on the parents' part to try and seek an understanding, to seek adjusting, even to seek a head count to know how many people died. And that was all covered up. That was when the machinery strung into gear. The story was not going to be about the death of children. The story was not going to be about the earthquake. The story that the Chinese Communist Party wanted was going to be China's coming out party. It was going to be about the Olympics. So straight away, initially, so after a while, initially we were allowed to report freely, but next thing you know, I was getting followed around. Parents that had spoken to me freely, after a while said they couldn't talk. They were being threatened. They showed me pieces of paper that said that they had forced to sign it to say that they had to agree to go back to normal life and not make any more trouble. Parents who tried to go to Beijing to protest, about the deaths of their children were followed and kicked back and imprisoned, and any number of things. So that's when I saw that maybe, this was the issue. This was the machinery that was going to swing in place. And then when it came to the 2008 Olympics, and that opened on the opening day was August 8, 2008. That was a day with that was chosen. The 8 is a very lucky number for Chinese, and 8808 was seen as a really, really good number. And coincidentally as well, it was also my birthday. I was born on August 8th. So there I was in the Olympic Stadium, and I was, seeing the lights of this, and I was still remembering all the people whose children had died. And there was this huge, at the same time, of course, this was a huge ceremony, and it's hard not to get excited about it in a sense and see this pageantry, right? There was a sweet little girl who sang this, popular ode to the motherland. There were giant fireworks that showed on the screen. There was this huge show that was orchestrated by Zhang Yimou, who is one of China's most famous film directors, who has done things like Raise the Red Lantern and filming. So, and then I'm going to read you a passage from a book that I ended up writing about the one-child policy, and this specifically looks at the Olympic issue. It said, nothing was what it seemed. That 2008 children that were singing about China's tribes, they were all Han Chinese. They weren't representative of any of the tribes. The girl who was singing that ode to the motherland song, she was lip syncing because she was a last minute replacement, as the actual singer wasn't considered pretty enough. And the fireworks that viewers saw on the TV screens were computer-generated imagery. And Zhang Yimou, the ringmaster who orchestrated this whole show, he would fall from grace for violating the one-child policy after online rumors floated that he had had several children. Family planning officials ended up slapping a 1.2 million fine on him. So the man who orchestrated China's biggest show would end up with the man with the biggest fine in the history of the one-child policy. And China's coming out party did mark the country's ascendance as a global superpower, especially after the Lehman Brothers collapse on Wall Street a few months later, which set into motion a chain of events that underscored America's shaky economic status. But far from displaying this can-do, fearless spirit, China would become increasingly paranoid about maintaining control, clamping down on media and displaying increasingly territorial behavior with its neighbors. A few months after the Olympics, activists unveiled Charter 08, a manifesto advocating reform along democratic lines. And China responded by jailing one of its authors, Liu Xiaobo. In 2010, Liu would be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, but he was unable to collect it since he was incarcerated at the time, and he died in 2017, still in incarceration. At this time, an influential Tsinghua University academic wrote, The Olympics marked the beginning, it can be said, of the stability preservation regime in China. Looking back now, it might be said that the Olympics were something we did that we ought not to have done. So that was in 2008. And here we are now. We are just 5 months away from the Olympics. Once again, this is the Beijing Winter Olympics, which will open on February 2, again, with the numbers. And this time around, I'm no longer working at the Wall Street Journal in China. As a matter of fact, the Wall Street Journal bureau in China has been really decimated to a huge degree because many journalists that work for the Journal, for New York Times, for a variety of publications have been kicked out of the country and they can no longer report freely. As for many of the local journalists, particularly the investigative journalism, profession, which had really grown by leaps and bounds at the time when I was there, is basically no longer able to operate freely. There have been a lot of activists and lawyers who have been jailed. China has become increasingly a very strong surveillance city. So here we are approaching a second games, and we have a million Uyghur and Turkic Muslims incarcerated. There have been huge rollback of freedoms in Hong Kong, which was traditionally one of the most freest places on Chinese soil that you could have. You could have a relatively free press there. You had a judicial system that was free for a long time when Hong Kong was supposed to be under a separate system, which retained some of the freedoms they had been slowly getting to enjoy prior to the return to China in 1997. So that's all gone now. And so where are we? Can we celebrate these games with that same kind, with those consciousness and all the things that have changed and gone before? Can we, there are all sorts of questions that we have and we face at my organization, which is Human Rights Watch. Now, I have a lot of questions for athletes who are concerned about whether or not they are able to, what if they, go into the country, can they use a virtual private network to even go anywhere, to look at their things? Because theoretically, that's not allowed. Can they, what if they wanted to mount a protest, which is not allowed under the IOC's laws on this? If you remember the Black Power salute in the Mexico Games, the athletes who did that were punished, even though we remember them long after. This is an issue now, and now we have increasingly more athletes who are much more activists in nature. Think of Simone Biles and the stance that she has taken, particularly on issues to do with abuse, sex abuse, for example. What is that going to be like? Our journalists are going to be allowed to cover these games. A lot of us as foreign journalists have been kicked out. And what are we to do about celebrating the glory of athletic achievement at the time when we know that quite a lot of people are being incarcerated for their beliefs, for their religious systems? There have been mass detentions, there's been torture, and all sorts of issues that have been well documented, not just by my organization, but many organizations as well, many news organizations. So this is where we stand right now. And at this point, I want to sort of maybe open it up for a few questions that you might have. I mean, and on this issue, because I think that's particularly where it becomes interesting. Where are we? What can we do? How do we view these games? What about the sponsors? What are some of the issues that that could be done? And I'd just like to really throw it out on the floor for all sorts of issues, because I can talk for any number of issues on this, and there's many ways to frame this. Only don't ask me about the scores of athletes, because I don't think I'll know that so well.
Awesome. Well, Mei, thank you so much. This has been such an incredible primer on the events to come in 2022. Everyone, if you have just recently tuned in, please drop any questions you have either in the chat window, or there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I'll be monitoring both of those. But again, Mei, thank you so much for your time today. We're honored to have you, and hopefully the next time you're able to join us, it'll be in person in Birmingham. But To kick it off, I'll start. So your book was actually titled, your recent book that you read from a little bit was actually titled "One Child: The Past and Future of China's Most Radical Experiment." So I'm curious, what is the future of China's most radical experiment?
Well, the future is after having had something like 30 plus years of a very restricted, single child household for a large portion of Chinese society, they've reversed it, of course, in the last few years, because they found that birth rates have plunged so much that they need to go in the other direction now. So there's a lot of work to try and actively encourage people to have what now, it's not a one child policy, two child policy, three child policy. I don't know how many child policy they're going to go down there. But the future is this: it's already set in place, regardless of however many children they can get people to have right now, which is that after 30 something years of radically changing the way we think about family planning and all that, China has a population that is, in summation, too old, too few, and too male. And what do I mean by that? Too male? Well, China was a very patriarchal society for a long time before the one-child policy, and so boys are much more valued than girls. And I say this because my grandparents are from mainland China, and I came from a very traditional family, even a Chinese family that retained a lot of the values. One of them was the love for sons. So my father is the 16th son, 1/6 out of 18 sons. And I am one of 5 daughters. And the reason why there are 5 girls is because they were trying for a boy. And my father was very disappointed not to have a son. So when you impose a culture, a policy where you say you can only have one, you then, of course, what a lot of families did was, okay, I have to choose to have a boy. So currently, right now, China has a surplus of men. And when we talk surplus, we're talking, with China, it's always huge numbers. We're talking 30 million men who have no hope of finding brides. And what I mean by 30 million is about the size of California. Imagine all of California filled with single men. And, that's where you are. And that creates a whole host of problems, and issues for people. There's issues with contributions to crime. There's issues to savings rates. There's issues of loneliness. There's issues of violence against women. There's issues of trafficking that you reach all the way from, to Russia and other parts of where women are being trafficked in. So that's one issue. When I say too old, what do I mean by that? What I mean is there's an imbalance in the population. They have a cohort of people who were born pre-one-child policy, and then they have the cohort of people born after the one-child policy. And so what it means is the ratio of working adults to support the elderly population is shrunk a lot. So a few years ago, China's ratio of working adults to the elderly is like something like 5-1, which is very productive. That's a good ratio to have. Then it's going to reverse itself very few. And so when you have, it's not a bad thing that people are living longer. The bad part, or the sad part, is that there's not enough working adults to support it. So what you're going to have is pension deficits. You're already seeing that in many cities. They don't have enough money to support this imbalance. And so that translates, of course, in a sense to on a single basis, a lot of pressure for single people to have to support so many people. They used to call it the little emperor generation, right? If you see in the cover of my book, that's supposedly your little emperor. You're one kid that gets all the grandparents and the parents, all that loving support. And when the parents age and the child grows up, then the child no longer becomes the little emperor. That child has to support 2 parents and 4 aging grandparents all by himself. And that's what they call it a 4-2-1 problem. And this is precisely why China has now reversed their policy and is trying desperately to urge people to have more children. And what was the last one? Too few, right? That's an issue too, right? You don't have enough people. And the thought of not having enough people was never, like this is the most populous nation. We've always heard that phrase, your billions, of people. When you have too few, which will happen in time, then there are all these questions about growth and economic growth and what it means for when you don't have a vibrant population. I mean, China is already one of the biggest purchases of robotics because they don't have enough labor right now in their factories. There's a labor shortage. There has been for quite a long time. And it's really hard for, I think, a lot of us outside to think of it that way, but that is the case now. So those things are actually rebounding, particularly on the Chinese themselves. It's hard that, so when I was writing this book, and for a long time, many people thought at the end of the day that despite these curbs and despite some of the many egregious practices that went into it, which meant, things like forced abortions and forced sterilizations, there was still some element of maybe it's not so bad because, hey, there are all these people lifted out of poverty. But now we're starting to see, well, you know what, this isn't truly the case because, this kinds of policies actually means that the economic growth of the future is going to be really severely curtailed in many ways. So, and then the question you have is, could this have been done better? Because you can look at many other countries who also had a very strong economic growth, a lot of without these kind of severe implications and backlashes from these policies. So that's the issue. So that's it in a nutshell. And I'm sorry if it's a little bit convoluted. I see a question here about whether or not they're importing women and from where. Well, the question is, so there's been a lot of cases of rise in trafficking, particularly from neighboring countries. So Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, North Korea, as far away as Russia, Bangladesh as well. These are cases of rising, and these are very sad cases, obviously, of that happening. There's also been, quite frankly speaking, also a rise in, and this is kind of like a strange phenomena in a way, a rise in the purchase of sex dolls. China manufactures these, so whenever people wanted to write a story about to sort of embody the gap, the gender gap. One of the quickest ways visually to do it would be go off to some, factory that makes all these sex dolls, and then you see, rows and rows of all these disembodied sex dolls going out for the lonely bachelors of China. And visually, of course, it's a very stunning thing, and it's kind of a bit weird, but it's also at the end of the day incredibly sad.
Thank you, Mei. We have a couple questions that I'll pull from the Q&A window as well. So Thomas, we're going to shift a little bit for a second, but Thomas was wondering your thoughts regarding the Taiwan-China relations, the recent Chinese intrusions in the Taiwan Strait, especially with a sizable Taiwanese population working in China.
Yes, that is going to be a big issue going ahead. Listen, I wish I had a crystal ball for this. I think we can certainly be concerned about rising tensions between this issue. This is certainly an issue that wasn't even on the cards maybe about 5 or 10 years ago. But as we saw, a lot of things that were maybe once upon a time a little unthinkable have become thinkable. So I would use it as an analogy, Hong Kong, right? Hong Kong was, handed over in 1997. There was an agreement that for 50 years, it would retain a lot of the freedoms that it had previously. So the freedom of press, the freedom of the independent judiciary system, a lot of these things. And then, the 50 years are not up, but that's changed already. Now they have the imposition of a national security law, which essentially rolls back a lot of these issues. So now, journalists are being kicked out as well. The judiciary system is being questioned. A lot of activists are being, in jail right now. And what we used to see in Hong Kong, which was peaceful protests that in the last few years became a little less peaceful, is no longer even allowed or tolerated. Once upon a time, and not so very long ago, in my lifetime at least, I, used to see every year somewhere between June and July, you would see, for example, the largest demonstrations commemorating Tiananmen Square. And the only ones to be had on Chinese style will be in Hong Kong at Victoria Park, where a lot of people would just peacefully gather and light their candles in remembrance of the people that were killed in Tiananmen in 1989. That's no longer possible. So, with regards to Taiwan, there's a lot of speculation there on that issue, and it's unclear, but there's certainly a lot more tension and a lot more questions on that than there used to be, say. And it's certainly the case that we do see much more aggression from China with its regards to the Southeast Asian countries. So there's a lot of concerns there too with its ASEAN neighbors, particularly around the buildup of these atolls that have now become, sort of little, they sort of become almost military garrisons in a way, potential to be, launch spots. So that's a lot of concern there.
Thank you, Mei. Another one, and could potentially be a good one to end on, because I think this is the multi-trillion-dollar question. As we observe what's unfolding in China in our news outlets and everything you've said about the rolling back of, freedom of the press in China, what limited freedom of the press existed 10 years ago is a lot less now. This is a question from Brooke Coleman in the chat. What do you think is an effective and realistic stance or set of actions for individuals, governments to take to combat China's human rights violations?
Well, that's a good question. Well, first of all, I think, China, for example, does care a lot in some cases about, how it stands within the UN, for example, within its allies in ASEAN or Africa or so forth. So to some degree, there is still much that can be done on that quarter, even if we don't know necessarily if the relationship between US China, which has always been, it might be, it does seem to have taken a turn for the worse, and it's unclear where that will go. But China still has relationships with lots of the rest of the world. So there is advocacy. There can be, actors that can be acted on to try and work with that. The second part of it, I think, also as well as business. That's an issue too. Much as there are many financial levers. China is much more open now, even though we say it's closed. But it is. Let's say comparison to say 50 years ago, there's a lot more issues with investments and banks and liquidity and all that can be levels of persuasion in some extent. So for example, with regards to the Olympics, right now, yes, there are a lot of major suppliers. There were all these there were sort of that would discuss with regards to whether or not they use forced labor, with regards to the creation of cotton from Xinjiang, which, and how that relates to the issue of Uyghur incarceration, for example. And then there, so all these, major companies are increasingly have to grapple with, okay, do we value the Chinese market, and do we do different things? Do we no longer designate Taiwan as a separate, origin, for example? And if not, we'll anger the Chinese and we won't be doing any business in China. On the other hand, if not, then we might anger the rest of the world, where we also have, a global reputation to preserve. So these are some, I think, levers where we as actors and consumers have to think about as well. Also, I think one issue is it's no longer a case where anything that happens in China stays in China, right? There are a lot of issues, for example, like one issue that I think particularly that we, my generation at the time, did not anticipate when we were covering China was the rise of surveillance technology right now, that is used to surveil quite a lot of people in China. The rise of, we thought, for example, at the time that when this happened, that, the internet, the openness, that would be great. But then we didn't realize that with things like cashless payments, then this would become one way for the government to track you and know where you are and know who you go with and all sorts of activities. And these surveillance technologies are increasingly being used and exported overseas to other oppressive regimes. So, and some of that technology doesn't just specifically come from China, it's also aided in part by other global companies. So that is an area, again, where we have some agency and some ability to act upon, I think.
Awesome. Thanks, May. We did get another question in the chat window from Dr. Nicole Jones. The question is, will China ever have a free market economy, or is the socialist market economy thought so embedded ideologically that it is not possible?
No, I mean, this is the part where I'm like, listen, I'm not an economist per se, but here's the thing. At the end of the day, I think, what we've seen in China is, what they call it as capitalism with socialist tendencies, right? The end of the day, I think paramount to everything else, the capitalism part is great for prosperity, but Beijing has signaled in many cases above prosperity is control. Right. So we've seen very recently, for example, some companies that tried to list and it's curbed and really wiped a lot of market share off in a way that doesn't make sense in a freewheeling market economy. At the end of the day, I think what we will see above and beyond a desire for the prosperity that comes with a freewheeling market economy is the ability to sort of control and clamp and change things. At the end of the day, I think that's what's going to supersede and be paramount above it all.
Thank you, May. I have another question, and it has to do again with the Olympics. And I mean, we talked about it a little bit earlier, but if the United States and other Western powers were to boycott the Olympics, is that a good idea? Would that have any success in putting pressure on the Xi regime?
Well, I think what Human Rights Watch has, and some of our other partners ask you for, it's not a wholesale boycott, because we do understand that athletes particularly have trained for a very long time to be, this is the stage for it. What we are advocating for is a diplomatic boycott. So maybe in a sense, not to have the leaders, government leaders, for example, show up in the opening day ceremony in a way that sort of lends credence and signals a sort of a tacit agreement to all that is going on in China at the moment. When you light the flame at the Olympic Stadium, you do so, and you're sitting there with the knowledge that you are in a country right now where millions of Turkic Muslims and Uyghurs are incarcerated in some harsh conditions. I think that has to be sort of made clear that is going on at the same time.
Absolutely. So, on that note, how confident can we be? I mean, you mentioned a lot of your colleagues not being able to enter the country anymore. Your colleagues who are still in China are, in a way, being silenced. How much trust can we put in the information that we do get from China?
Well, that's a very difficult thing, right? Because, here's the thing. I mean, like, I talked to many of my colleagues who are still, foreign correspondents, and many of them still trying to report. And one of the things they say is, listen, there are things we can do from, from perched on, wherever we are in Korea or Taiwan or wherever. But what really is missing when you're not in the country is the nuance you take. So the further away from it, then the more you see things in black and white, right? It's like, bad things happening all the time. But when you're in the country, you can do great, wonderful stories about people and their lives and how they're changing and how they react to things. So it's no longer just a black and white issue. Some of the colleagues that have done great work in China have done it on, not on, horrible things happening all the time, but, the strive for empowerment and power and the terrific innovation and energy that the Chinese people have. And that's hard to do when you're doing it from a distance. And that's what I really, think is missing. There's a lot to celebrate about China's rise, about Chinese people's innovation and ingenuity and the desire for human dignity and human rights. I just wish and I know that all of us wish we were back there to be able to write more about those things.
Absolutely. Well, maybe one day soon, you'll be able to go back. But in the meantime, May, we just thank you so much for taking the time. We are honored that you could join us tonight. Everyone, just for the record, May's book is called One Child, The Past and Future of China's Most Radical Experiment. Callie and I will share that with the BCFR later on, but I think we're at a good point right now. We will hear from Fareed Zakaria in about 15 minutes. So we can take a quick break. May, you're welcome to stay on if you'd like. I am going to screen share in 15 minutes the talk from Fareed Zakaria. But if you're not able to join that, or if if your internet cuts out or anything like that, I just shared the link to that webinar in the chat. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. May, any final thoughts?
Well, I would encourage some of the more technical, more difficult questions. Ask Fareed about that. Just gonna change. Thank you guys so much. I wish I could see your faces and see you in person, but thank you even for giving me this amount of time and listening to me. I really do appreciate it and showing so much interest in this issue. Thank you.
Absolutely, May. Thank you for everything that you do, and for everything that Human Rights Watch does around the world. We thank you for that, and we hope to see you in Birmingham soon. All right. All right. Well, I'm going to mute and turn off my video. We'll take a quick break, and we'll see y'all back here in 15 minutes. Thanks, everybody. Hey everyone, so if you're still with us, thank you for sticking around. We just took a quick break and our conversation with Fareed Zakaria is about to start and should be about 1 minute. So I'm sharing my screen and you should be able to see it, and look forward to hearing from Mr. Zakaria.
Most important relationship of the 21st century. The National Committee strengthens that relationship by helping people on both sides of the Pacific to understand one another better and to address issues of mutual concern through exchanges, dialogues, and other activities. These programs address key issues such as economic relations, rule of law, security, public health, and the environment, in the belief that constructive Sino-American relations benefit both countries as well as the global community.
Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to all of you joining us live across the United States, China, and this year in the United Kingdom. I'm Steve Orlins, President of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, and I am pleased to welcome audiences from 88 venues to our 15th annual China Town Hall. Before we begin, I would also like to take a moment to express our condolences to the family of a close friend of the National Committee, General Colin Powell. We all mourn his passing. U.S.-China relations are at a crossroads. The last 4 years have seen ties between our two countries reach lows not seen since before the establishment of diplomatic relations between the United States and China in 1979. As the relationship undergoes enormous changes, the major constant is that all agree that U.S.-China relations will help determine the peace and prosperity of the 21st century. Through these changes, the National Committee has steadfastly believed that understanding China and crafting good policies based on that understanding would make Americans more prosperous and secure. We started China Town Hall 15 years ago in the hope of educating Americans throughout the country about China. Over the years, we have hosted former presidents, secretaries of state, national security advisors, and ambassadors to China. This year, for the first time, we have invited a journalist to serve as our speaker. At a time when all too often, traditional media focuses on the headline and a 3-minute story, Dr. Fareed Zakaria looks at the issues in depth and truly educates his viewers. This should come as no surprise, as Dr. Zakaria is the award-winning host of Fareed Zakaria GPS for CNN Worldwide, a Washington Post columnist, and a best-selling author of 7 books, including the recently published 10 Lessons for a Post-Pandemic World, to our 15th annual China Town Hall. Before we begin, I would also like to take a moment to express our condolences to the family of a close friend of the National Committee, General Colin Powell. We all mourn his passing. U.S.-China relations are at a crossroads. The The last 4 years have seen ties between our two countries reach lows not seen since before the establishment of diplomatic relations between the United States and China in 1979. As the relationship undergoes enormous changes, the major constant is that all agree that US-China relations will help determine the peace and prosperity of the 21st century. Through these changes, the National Committee has steadfastly believed that understanding China and crafting good policies based on that understanding would make Americans more prosperous and secure. We started China Town Hall 15 years ago in the hope of educating Americans throughout the country about China. Over the years, we have hosted former presidents, secretaries of state, national security advisors, and ambassadors to China. This year, for the first time, we have invited a journalist to serve as our speaker. At a time when all too often, traditional media focuses on the headline and a 3-minute story, Dr. Fareed Zakaria looks at the issues in depth and truly educates his viewers. This should come as no surprise, as Dr. Zakaria is the award-winning host of Fareed Zakaria GPS for CNN Worldwide, a Washington Post columnist, and a best-selling author of 7 books, including the recently published 10 Lessons for a Post-Pandemic World. We are thrilled to have him here with us today, and I am happy I can play Fareed Zakaria to Fareed Zakaria and interview the interviewer. I would also like to thank our speakers at our 88 venues who are leading voices on US foreign policy in China, as well as our partners across the United States and China for hosting this event. Thank you also to the Henry Luce Foundation for its continued generosity in funding China Town Hall, and to our National Committee staff for working tirelessly to coordinate this event. Fareed, thank you so much for being here. Let me jump right into the questions. As I mentioned in my introduction, this is kind of the low point for US-China relations since before we established diplomatic relations in 1979. Should the average American be concerned? How does it affect the average American's lives?
Well, first, thanks for having me, Steve. It's a huge pleasure to be here. Yes, I think the average American should be concerned because the cliches are true. This is going to be the most important relationship of the 21st century. It's going to define the 21st century. It's the biggest new thing that has happened to the international system, really in 100 years, right? If you think about the rise and fall of great powers as being one of those great engines of change, turmoil, revolution, well, the rise of China is on that scale. 20 years ago, China was 1% of global GDP. It's now about 15% of global GDP. There's virtually no country has had as dramatic a rise. And it's probably headed toward 20% of global GDP, which is roughly where the United States is. So the 21st century is going to be defined by these two powers. And what's interesting is you'll notice after the two of them, there's a big drop off. So China is the #2 economy in the world, but it's larger than #3, #4, #5, and #6 put together. Similarly, defense budget. US is, of course, #1, China is #2, but the Chinese defense budget is larger than the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th put together. So that's why I tend to think we're back in a bipolar world, you know, a world in which these two superpowers, one clearly bigger than the other, the United States by far the #1, but they outrank everyone else. And the question for the 21st century is going to be, can these two superpowers find a way to coexist, to cooperate, to compete, but to do so within the framework of a strategic relationship that recognizes there are huge costs to going down a path that leads us to another Cold War. And if we can get that right, and this is on both sides, this is not, we tend to often think of as though America is the only actor here. Obviously, China gets a vote on this too. But if we can do that, I think you could imagine a 21st century that's quite different from one that ends up being filled with arms races, conflict, proxy wars. That's the thing people forget about the Cold War is the degree to which it transformed and warped not just international life, but the life of every, the average person in these countries. And so those are the stakes. We're going to live in a bipolar 21st century. Bipolarity is a given. A Cold War is a policy choice for both countries.
But would you say we are in a Cold War now?
No, I don't think.
It's
I think
a long
that
discussion in
I think that
newspaper these days.
So the fundamental structural driver of the Cold War was, let's remember, Stalin's decision to essentially invade all of Eastern Europe. Not quite invade, but the Red Army had liberated those places from the Nazis to install puppet regimes there, then to try to go south into Greece and Turkey. And that then provokes a reaction from Western Europe and the United States, and thus begins the Cold War. So when you think about China, it has not yet done anything on that scale. And more importantly, the Soviet Union and the United States were kind of hermetically sealed from one another economically, even culturally, even during World War II. The peak year of trade between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War was about $2 billion of trade a year. The United States and China do $2 billion of trade every day. And even, it might surprise people watching to know, in the last couple of months, we have been buying more stuff from China rather than less, despite all the geopolitical tensions. And that gets at a kind of fundamental reality of today's world, which is it is deeply interdependent in a very complicated way. So, nobody decided that they wanted to have closer economic ties with China over the last 3 months. In fact, both sides of, in many ways, the governments are trying in their way to untangle themselves a little bit. But here's what happened. Americans stopped going to the gym and started to buy Pelotons. Well, guess where Pelotons are made? They're made in China. So you see, we're both locked into such an interdependent relationship that things happen without anyone wanting them to. And by the way, that's one of the glories of the complexity of a kind of open trading system in the world, that you can get stuff from everywhere, you can interact with lots of people. And if we did really go down the path of a Cold War, I think all that would unravel. It would become, and in the worst case scenario, we go back to isolated, autarkic economies and a huge amount of conflict and confrontation.
Your defense statistic is interesting because I often hear it that the United States defense budget exceeds the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh countries combined. But you talk about it, that China's exceeds those next five also, which
By the way,
is a very different way of looking at it.
That also happens to be true. The US is so much higher. The US spends about $750 billion. China spends about $250 or something like that. And then it really drops off, as you can imagine. Yeah. But it's important to point out, the Chinese have been building up, they've been expanding their military spending significantly. So it's not that there aren't reasons to be concerned. And again, it's not that the Chinese have not done things that should cause alarm. They have, and particularly under Xi. But the question is, do we have, for the United States, this is a very difficult challenge. The United States is very comfortable historically, either withdrawing from the international system or dominating it. Withdrawing from the international system is Washington's farewell address. Just, keep out of that damned European continent with all its ills and duplicity and Machiavellian machinations. John Quincy Adams says, we don't want to go around the world looking for monsters to destroy. Domination is post-World War II, right? We basically built the international system in our image. The challenge is going to be for the next 100 years, maybe, we're going to have to find a way to live within a system where we're still number one, but we don't embody the system. We're not so far above everybody else. And China, in that sense, becomes the principal country that is a rival. We've in some ways, we've had it lucky. In the last 60 years, 70 years, the two countries that rose economically to quasi-great power status economically were Japan and Germany, both in a sense returning. But it didn't change the geopolitics of the world at all, because both were American allies. Both existed within the American security umbrella. Both were closely tied to the US by treaty. So China is really the first great power to have risen into this post-World War II system that we built that is not a Western ally, that is not an American. I mean, honestly, the Japan and Germany could be described as American satellites.
Yeah, both were functioning democracies. Which perfectly lead into the first question from the audience, which is from Daniel Yu of the American Bar Association. And he asks, how do we balance our economic and business interests that you've referred to, desiring Chinese cooperation on global health and climate change, and China's potential threats towards Western values, such as human rights, democracy, regional and international peace? And obviously he's referring to Hong Kong and Xinjiang also.
It's a big question. In a way, it is the central question, which is, it's almost asking, how should we conduct our relations with China, given the opportunities and the challenges, right? So the way I would put it is, I think that there are some areas where you have to search for a win-win solution and for cooperation with the Chinese, because everyone is better off that way. Trade is a perfect example. The Chinese do cheat on trade, and they are protectionist on trade. By the way, so are we. The United States, Europe have massive agricultural subsidies, for example. We have everything the Biden administration is doing with regard to this Build Back Better plan, the Buy America provisions in that, are protectionist. They are against the spirit of the World Trade Organization. They would probably be found in violation if somebody brought them, So there's a very good tally of this, and it points out in the last 20 years, the US has put in place more protectionist measures than any country in the world, very much including China. China is not even second. I think it's Brazil, India, then maybe China is seventh. So China has many non-market features that are a huge problem. But I believe that there are win-win solutions here, because the Chinese also want trade. They also want to be able to be a player in a system in which they're increasingly moving up the value chain. So do you know who the largest filer of patents as a single company in the world last year was? Huawei. So China is now getting to the point where it doesn't want intellectual property stolen, because it's generating a lot of intellectual property. So there's that whole bunch of areas where there are real disagreements. The obvious thing to do is for the US, Europe, and Japan to get together, come up with a common negotiating position and push hard with the Chinese. Then there are areas where the Chinese are trying to erode the basic norms, values of the international system, human rights, the issues relating to whether or not there should be pushback from outside the world when you renege on a treaty or an agreement like Hong Kong, which it does not have some kind of clear legal status, but the Chinese government did promise in the handover documents to the British that they would honor a kind of one country, two system model, which they have not. So on those ones, I think the United States, the West in general, should stand tough. I mean, I think we should not compromise. We should not pretend these issues don't exist. We should air the differences. We should, hold them accountable in the sense that we can. Again, always better to do this with other countries than by ourselves. But I fear that this balance that the question was asking about is politically very difficult to do. When Truman outlined to Senator Vandenberg, the Republican whose support he was trying to get, that he wanted to have a strategy towards the Soviet Union that we now call containment. Vandenberg said to him, Mr. President, the only way this will work is if you go on TV and scare the hell out of the American people. Otherwise, we're not going to be. And my fear is that, you know, in order to get some of the things people want to get on the more confrontational side, you're going to exaggerate the threat, minimize the areas for cooperation. And that could lead us down a very dangerous path, because one thing we must always keep in mind in this conversation is China is not some inanimate object out there. It's got its own politics, it's got its own culture, it's got its own society. So when we do things, you know, it has an impact on them.
Yeah. Yep. Let's go to our first question from the audience, from Catherine Ng, who is right here in New York City, and she'll be on video.
Hi, I'm Catherine. I'm calling in from New York City. My question is about US shifting Asia priorities and relations with Europe. Since the Obama administration, the US has been trying to pivot to Asia, but without too much success. We're now at a moment where the country is able to shift more completely to Asia, but is also straining alliances along the way. For example, we withdrew from Afghanistan, but at a bit of a cost there. The US signed an AUKUS deal that left France upset. It seems like in the Biden administration's hurry to tee up the China strategy and compete with China, that it's causing Europeans to feel the relationship with the US is a bit transactional, and perhaps it's fueling strategic autonomy as well. And yet, a strong European coalition is necessary to effectively confront China. How would you evaluate Biden's China policy as it currently stands? Thank you.
Sure, it's a good question. I would say that she accurately described some of the costs along the way as the Biden administration has been trying to pivot to Asia. And she points out the pivot really began with Bush. The younger Bush's outreach to India with the nuclear deal, which was a big, you know, an extraordinary reversal of US policy. For 35 years, we'd punished the Indians for having a nuclear weapon. And then we normalized it. And it was largely because there was the desire to bring India into the fold. Then the Obama pivot to Asia, so articulated, putting troops in Australia, a kind of base in the Philippines, all of which then led to what the Biden administration has tried to do. As usual, Trump is a kind of weird aberration where he doesn't really quite have a policy. It's schizophrenic. One day he loves Xi Jinping, the other day he's bashing him. I would say that the Biden policy is very much a continuation along these lines. And yeah, there was some bruised feelings. Some of those you could have then dealt with better. The Afghanistan withdrawal could have been handled a bit better. The AUKUS deal could have been handled better. But the fundamental direction, I think, is correct, which is that the United States should be shoring up the alliances in Asia that will allow it to deter Chinese aggression, to maintain an American presence in the Pacific. And by and large, I think the driver there has been Chinese behavior. So you look at two places in particular, Australia and India. In both cases, the Australians were trying to play a game of having it both ways, of having very close economic ties with the Chinese and close geopolitical ties with the Americans. The Indians were trying to be very passive, and they were willing to kind of go along with things like the Quad as long as there was no military component, as long, you know, they would often send a very junior minister to those meetings. And then the Chinese under Xi became, you know, much more aggressive, issuing the set of demands to Australia, in the case of India, having that border skirmish. And in both places, the domestic politics have changed. As a result, the foreign policy has changed. And there is much more of a sense of kind of inviting the US to play a role to help these countries feel like they're not on their own. So I think it's, broadly speaking, been successful. One point I'd make about Europe, yes, we need to make sure that there's a way to pivot toward Asia that is both taking the Europeans along and through Europe as a sense, in a sense, as opposed to against Europe. There is going to be some concern on their part that they're being abandoned. I think it's actually the way to point it out is it's largely good news. It means Europe is not the cockpit of potential war. I mean, that was the issue in the in the Cold War, was people worried that the Soviet Union was going to move millions of men through Europe, through the Fulda Gap in Germany to kind of conquer Europe. That concern is largely gone, though of course Putin does represent a threat to places like the Baltic states and Poland and Ukraine. But the action has moved to Asia. So naturally, US foreign policy should move there. Europe will never act, final point, because you mentioned, Europe will never be a strategic actor. That is a bridge too far. It is an extraordinary, the European Union is an extraordinary achievement, the most extraordinary sustained institutionalized cooperation among countries that fought each other for 400 or 500 years, but they will never become one country. I mean, Berlin and Paris will never subcontract their foreign policy.
We have a question relating to the increase in kind of anti-Asian violence in the United States, anti-Asian activity in the United States, from Alice in Austin, Texas.
I'm Alice E. from Austin, Texas. I plan to watch the town hall with our Austin Asian Community Civic Coalition members. Here are my questions. FBI wrongfully accused many Chinese scientists before, like Wenhou Li, Sherry Chen, and many, many more. If U.S.-China relationship going backwards, what challenges are we going to face as a Chinese American living in U.S.?
Yeah, it's a very real concern. Part of it is that once you sharpen the divisions and the geopolitical tensions rise, it becomes much easier for people to start suspecting and being suspicious and casting doubt on the loyalty of Chinese Americans in ways that are completely unfair. You already see it happening. People like Mike Pompeo and other Republicans have been accusing universities of becoming hotbeds of spying activity. Again, very rarely do they have specific charges or let alone proof, but these are easy things to say. And I think we should be aware that this is a challenge that Chinese Americans have faced almost uniquely among Asian Americans because of the Asian Exclusion Acts, Chinese labor that was brought in, the way in which they have been historically discriminated against. So it's very easy to bring up, if you scratch these tendencies, it's very easy to bring up a certain amount of racism and xenophobia. I worry a lot about this. If you look back over American history, America reacts badly when it gets scared. When we get scared, we lash out, whether it's at the Irish, Jews, the Chinese, the Red Scare, McCarthyism, even after 9/11, some of the attacks on Muslims. If we were instead, again, to be calm, sensible, pragmatic, understand this is a challenging relationship. It's not just better for the relationship, better for the world, but we don't distort our own values and our own society in the pursuit of some confrontation abroad.
Yeah. I think the good news on this is that the Asian American Pacific Islander community has actually begun to organize, and we've seen responses. Some charges have been dropped. We saw this case at the University of Tennessee, Professor Hu, where the federal judge ultimately threw out the case. And then this past weekend, the University of Tennessee reinstated the professor. So we're beginning to see progress, and we're seeing letters from Stanford, from MIT, professors at Stanford, from MIT, objecting to using race or Asian heritage as a basis for any kind of investigation. Let's talk a little bit about, you wrote this very interesting piece about normalizing many of the Trump, last month, normalizing many of the Trump administration's foreign policies. And you talk about Cuba, you talk about Iran, you talk about us, but for China, so tariffs, delisting of Chinese companies from US stock exchanges, visa restrictions, journalist restrictions, state-owned media restrictions in the United States. Why are these still in place?
You know, there's something about Donald Trump that I think people mostly don't quite understand. He's very clever and in sensing the political mood. So in all of these areas, Cuba policy, Iran policy, and China policy, he changed the default position. He changed the operating position, and it turns out it's politically very hard to reverse it, because take Cuba as a simple example. If Biden were to try and reverse Cuba policy right now, Senator Robert Menendez, the ranking Democrat the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, would be appalled. He's very hawkish on Cuba. Now Biden needs his vote on these two big bills that are coming up, right? So on China, I think that Biden criticized the tariffs throughout the campaign, in my opinion, completely correctly and intelligently, pointing out, A, Americans were paying the cost for the tariffs, 100% right. B, they were not working, 100% right. And C, by the way, you could point out that it hasn't changed Chinese behavior at all. I mean, but were he to reverse them, you will see the barrage of tweets from Marco Rubio and Josh Hawley and things like that. Now, my own view is that is a mistake, because I think that, first of all, policy toward China is too important to play the politics with. You should try to figure out what the right thing to do is and do it. And secondly, those guys are going to attack you no matter what. I mean, I don't think I need to tell President Biden, we're living in a very polarized country. And if he wants to get a glimpse of that, watch the way in which Republican senators reacted to Biden's summit meeting with Putin, which was a pretty normal summit. They exchanged the usual free and frank exchange. The Fox News and Republican senators literally described it as Munich, as Biden having appeased Putin in a way that was going to lead to a world war. I mean, it was fantastical, right? And so if you're going to get attacked as being Neville Chamberlain at Munich, when you have a routine bilateral with Putin, you're going to be attacked on your China policy no matter what. So you might as well do the right thing, because you're going to pay the political price of being pummeled from the right anyway.
Do you think that the actual inflation that is now occurring in the United States, combined with the beginning of the progressive Democrats advocating for an ending of the tariffs because of their regressive nature, the people who are most affected by these tariffs are poorer Americans? Do you think we'll see a reversal of that? And we're seeing Ambassador Tai speaking with Vice Premier Liu He. You think we'll see some of these tariffs get ended?
I think you're beginning to see the reestablishment of real dialogue, which is very good. You're seeing the reestablishment of some kind of strategic relationship. I still think the Biden administration doesn't know how to handle the politics of the China relationship. Look, to be fair to them, part of the problem is they will have very few allies on the Democratic side either. I mean, you look at Chuck Schumer, you look at Nancy Pelosi, you're not going to find, there used to be in the US Senate in particular, a kind of group of wise men who had a broader strategic national security orientation, the Sam Nunns of the world, the Daniel Patrick Moynahans of the world, Lugar, and people like that. Those people don't exist anymore. And so what you have now is a much more political, partisan Senate. And so I think Biden is trying to figure out whether or not there's space there. My sense is maybe they would do it in the context of some kind of overall agreement where where the Chinese also make some concessions. But unfortunately, I don't see much movement. And as you say, it's highly regressive. These tariffs are basically taxes that are paid for by middle class and working class Americans.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in an inflationary environment, it's a good way to actually reduce pressure for inflation. Let's talk about some of the shared challenges that the United States and China are confronting, especially climate change. We have questions. We have a partnership with the Schwarzman Scholars Program at Tsinghua University, and two of their students have submitted some questions on the topic of climate cooperation. So if we could hear from them.
Hi, Fareed. My name is John Rendon. I'm from Brooklyn, New York, and the 5th cohort of Schwartzman Scholars. I'm here representing Meetup Chinese Group in Charlotte, North Carolina. My question concerns climate change. In the past, we heard climate change mentioned alongside pandemic control and prevention as an area where the United States and China, no matter their differences, could cooperate and find common ground. Yet the experience of the COVID-19 pandemic showed us that the differences between China and the United States state interests and government systems made that cooperation very difficult, if not disappointing. Why should we expect climate change to be different? Thanks.
Hi, my name is Alliance, and I'm currently a Schwartzman Scholar at Tsinghua University residing in Beijing in China. Leading up to the COP26 conference at the end of this month, my question is, knowing that both China and the US are global superpowers with key roles in helping achieving a net zero future, so what are the immediate actions that both countries have to take in order to ensure that we're en route to a sustainable climate change future? Thank you.
Well, they're both very good questions. And the first one pointedly says, you know, why has this been so difficult? And I think the reason it's difficult is because it's actually not an area where you are going to get much because of a treaty or an agreement between the two sides. On this issue, I dissent a little bit from the conventional wisdom. You know, the Chinese are going to do what they want to do and what they need to do to get their emissions down for their own reasons. They're not going to do them because the United States forces Beijing to do it. And the same is true of the United States. These are decisions largely made by countries because of their own sense of commitment and political pressure or societal pressure. And the Chinese have been doing a certain amount because there has been a lot of concern in China about dirty air and dirty water and such. But I don't quite see where the opportunity for a win-win here is, in the sense that the Chinese are going to reduce emissions if they want to, and the Americans are going to reduce emissions if they want to, and you know, maybe they'll get together in places like Paris, the Paris Accords, which are entirely voluntary, and they can symbolically commit to them. I think that the area for cooperation would be really if there were efforts to help the poorer countries in the world get to green energy faster, and rather than being completely competitive about it, to find ways to help with project financing and things like that. Right now, we're going about it in an entirely competitive way. The Chinese do their Belt and Road Initiative. The United States is trying to offer various other forms and is trying to counter that. That's probably suboptimal. But I have to say, my biggest concern right now about climate change, you know, this takes us off the topic of US-China slightly, but is we are all committed and committing to a world in which we are going to phase out these fossil fuels very fast. And so there's very little investment going in, a lot of shaming of it, a lot of winding down of natural gas, for example, in the US. But we don't have green technology at the scale we needed. And most importantly, in what utility would call in terms of base load capacity, in other words, the always on energy that an electric utility needs to provide electricity when the sun is not shining and the wind is not blowing. And right now, what you're seeing are very big gaps between, you know, you're winding down fossil fuel, but you're not ramping up. We can't ramp up green enough. That's why you have these blackouts in places like California. That's why you have this energy crisis in Britain. My fear is we are, you know, this is not something you can just aspirationally wish for. It needs a lot of very careful planning. If you are going to take one power plant offline because it's coal-fired or natural gas-fired, you have to have something that replaces it kilowatt for kilowatt. You mean, you have to find those sources, and if you can't find them, you have to keep the fossil fuel on for a little bit longer. You know, move from coal to gas because it's half the emissions. Like, these are difficult trade-offs, but with regard to this subject, people assume if your intentions are good, the problem is going to solve itself. it won't. It takes a lot of implementation to make this work.
But sure, certainly sharing of technologies in this area would be beneficial. Sharing of technologies to protect cities, creating smarter cities. We've seen floods right here in New York. We've seen terrible floods in China, where we've seen significant deaths from in the
And that took us in a place where cooperation became impossible. I mean, it's strange because the height of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union cooperated to jointly inoculate the world from smallpox. And the eradication of smallpox was an extraordinary example of superpower cooperation at the height of the Cold War. This was in the 50s. So pre the arms control, this was at the point where people thought the United States and the Soviet Union could fight a nuclear war. And at that very point, they were cooperating on global public health.
Yeah.
We can't do it right now.
Yeah, it was one of the disappointments. We, of course, had reduced our medical presence in China. Prior to that, we had people from our CDC embedded in China's CDC, from our National Science Foundation. And in 2017 and 18, they got withdrawn, which didn't help us understand what had occurred when COVID started.
And Steve, that's an important point about how to influence China. This is a huge country, civilization, 5,000 years old, now very rich and powerful. Some part of how we will get them to do things we think are right and not do bad things is going to be deterrence, is to be strong, be tough, push back. But some of it surely is also going to be cooperation, being there, involving ourselves, getting to know people, getting to as you said, our CDC, their CDC, our SEC working with their SEC. For two reasons. One, you do build some trust and goodwill. Secondly, you have some familiarity with what's going on in that place. And finally, they don't want to break the bonds either. They also, interdependence creates a certain kind of asymmetrical power for you. They don't want to get it all to be cut off and isolated. So the threat of pulling people out could be one of your bargaining chips. If we isolate them completely, if we isolate ourselves completely, we lose much leverage over them. I mean, one of the things that I've always pointed out to people is we keep sanctioning countries with whom we have no contact. North Korea, Iran, Venezuela, and then Cuba, and then we're surprised that the sanctions don't work. Well, they don't hurt very much if the countries actually have very little dealing with one another. So keeping the bonds actually in a weird way gives us more leverage.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about trade and investment. As you've pointed out, it's enormous and so important. And let's go back to the Obama years when Obama had led the negotiation of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was a high standard trade and investment agreement. Secretary Clinton and President Trump decided they were going to withdraw from it, and then President Trump won the election and he did withdraw from it. As you pointed out in a wonderful story the day after the United States announced its partnership with Australia and the United Kingdom to provide Australia for, I think, $60 billion with nuclear propelled subs. China, the day after, applied for accession to what was the Trans-Pacific Partnership, is now called the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's kind of got amended somewhat, and it now exists with 11 countries, including Australia and Japan, some of our closest allies. You and I believe this is a big deal, but people don't much share our view. Why? What's going on here?
Well, economics always kind of goes under the radar. Trade economics in particular is so arcane and complicated and obscure that people don't pay attention. But of course, it is often the big thing that undergirds relations. So, it's possible that what's going on here is that the Chinese realized that the real threat that they faced was not an American aircraft carrier, but was that the United States was bringing together all the major economies in Asia in this Trans-Pacific Partnership, which were then going to have a kind of counterweight to China, and we're going to be able to write the agenda, write the rules, whether it's intellectual property, trade practices, and such. And so once America foolishly, in a sense, commits the own goal of withdrawing from a trade treaty that it had sponsored, imagined, dreamed up, corralled these other 11 countries into doing, the Chinese were like, well, maybe we should get involved. Now, I don't think China will be led into the TPP, but it's a kind of clever move. And it highlights the cost that the United States is paying in not being part of the TPP. The TPP basically opened up markets like Japan to America that had long been closed. It actually had many concessions on wages, on environmental issues that the left wanted and were able to get. It's a remarkably progressive trade treaty. But again, Trump poisoned the atmosphere so much that it became impossible to get out of it. If things continue to go south, though, I do think the Chinese will, whether formally through the mechanism of joining the TPP or not, they will take advantage. If America retreats more and more into isolation and protectionism, the Chinese benefit because the rest of the world can't afford to do that. The US is still a vast domestic economy. We think we're very globalized. We're not. 80% of the US economy is a domestic economy. Trade is only 20% of our economy. But you go to Thailand, you go to Malaysia, you go to Singapore, you go to Taiwan, these countries are entirely dependent on trade. Even Germany, 50% of German GDP is trade.
But you're thinking that China will never get in, or will not
I
get
think
in
it's
for the
tough.
next decade?
Yeah, there's a provision in there that says non-market economies can't join. And there is significant, I think there's enough reality to China not having a real market economy. And secondly, given where the Australians are and the Japanese are right now, they would veto it, is my guess. I think it would take either significant reforms or significant cajoling from the Chinese. I think the Chinese have, we've talked a lot about American policy. Xi has fundamentally misunderstood how to handle his Asian neighbors. I think that the Xi approach has been be very strong, be very tough, and you will command their respect. It's not working. It's having exactly the opposite impact. I can tell you, intimately knowing the India story, the Indians were really not very anti-Chinese. They were being pushed by the US to get more involved with the Quad. And then Xi launches this skirmish in the Himalayas, this border.
It's not clear what happened.
It's not clear what happened.
We don't know what happened. Nobody's explained it well.
What we know is that the Chinese and the Indians fought hand to hand because they'd been luckily told not to use weapons. The Chinese ended up with 20 square miles of additional territory. But this is like frozen wasteland tundra territory. I don't know what they would do with it. But as a result, it completely changed India's foreign policy toward China. They banned hundreds of Chinese apps. They've essentially banned all Chinese investment into the country. And they are now much more actively participating, even at a defense level, with the Quad. So I would put it to Xi Jinping, was it worth it? You got 20 miles of frozen tundra and you changed, the foreign policy of 1.2 to 1.3 billion people.
I would argue the same with respect to the South China Sea,
Right.
that the consequences of China's actions in the South China Sea and the benefits that they derive don't outweigh the costs that it's created in terms of unifying the Asian countries with the United States in opposition to China's.
There's a familiar dynamic in international relations, which is balancing. Countries first try to balance against a rising power, rising threat. Only if they feel they cannot balance, then they jump on the bandwagon. So the truth is, because of America in large part, these countries can balance. They can balance China. And so as long as that dynamic is at play, with China, Deng Xiaoping was very wise. When he outlined China's relations to the world and sort of said, hide your light under a bushel. I think it wasn't just that he was saying we're weak right now. I think Deng understood that China is not the United States. The United States grew to great world power surrounded by two vast oceans and two weak neighbors. Right? Sorry to the Mexicans and Canadians listening. China is growing rich and powerful in the middle of Asia. It has 16 neighbors and 16 border disputes, and all these countries watch the rise of China and they get anxious, and managing that rise is a task worthy of a Bismarck, and Xi Jinping is no Bismarck.
Why? And then I want to get off of CPTPP, but during the Obama administration, national security professionals, so our armed forces, the Secretary of Defense said that, joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership was more valuable than a bunch of aircraft carrier groups, that it really created another pillar for America's presence in Asia. There's really silence today from our national security professionals on that. Some of the, folks who work on economics said this would be good for America. The net growth in jobs is easy to quantify. This would be good. But there's not a bunch of national security folks who said this would be great for what the first questioner asks, our pivot to Asia.
I think it's an important question, and it's fundamentally because trade has become a dirty word in Washington, because everybody thinks that it is by focusing on trade and globalization and neglecting the American worker whose wages have declined, that is what got us Donald Trump, that is what got us this wave of populism. And so everyone is sort of genuflecting to what they see as this political atmosphere. The truth is, the United States did not open itself up blindly to trade over the last 20 years. We have actually not opened up our economy as much as other countries. We're the laggard. And as I said, we have more protectionist measures in place. Many of those, by the way, are what hurt American workers. And one of the reasons for the decline in wages actually has to do with the fact that we weren't keeping pace with the rest of the world. The big number everyone talks about is this one China study that found 2 million jobs. American manufacturing workers lost 2 million jobs because of what is called the China shock. Nobody read the study. That's over 15 years. Okay, that comes to about 150,000 jobs every year. Now, do you know how many jobs American workers lose every year through the normal churning of the American economy? 60 million. So this is 150,000 jobs out of 60 million that are lost every year through all kinds of reasons. Now, some of those are voluntary, people resign, people move locations. But even if you take it, there's a very good calculation done by the International Institute for International Economics. It basically comes to the conclusion that for every job lost to trade with China, there were 150 other jobs lost by American workers to technology, to productivity gains, to all kinds of other things. None of those people have been, none of those job losses have become the center of American political debate. And it's important to point out, when we talk about manufacturing jobs, because that's what we're talking about with China, those were the 2 million. Manufacturing is been a shrinking percent of the American workforce for 75 years. We've been going down, down, down. If you look at Germany, a country that has a trade surplus that supports manufacturing, manufacturing is at the heart of the German economy. The decline in manufacturing in Germany is the same as the United States, in some areas even worse. And guess what? What country is now seeing a decline in manufacturing jobs? China. Since 2012, manufacturing jobs have been declining in China. Why? Because as countries move up the economic ladder, they shift from goods-based economies to services. And when you move up into services, you're losing manufacturing jobs. We produce more. This is, again, one of the things people don't understand. We make more stuff than we ever did before. Manufacturing output in America is higher than it's ever been. We just need fewer people to do it.
I want to get to some of the soft power issues. Amanda from Los Angeles has asked a question about soft power. So if we could hear her question.
Hi, my name is Amanda Wallen-Savage, and I have a question about American soft power. American cultural products, whether that's film, TV, or pop music, have allowed people around the world, and especially in China, to learn about American society and values. However, today it's becoming increasingly difficult to access American media in China. What might the long-term implications of this trend be? Or, to put it differently, what will happen if America continues to lose its ability to leverage its soft power in China?
It's a good question. Two forces are at work. One is that China has become more closed under Xi Jinping and is, in a sense, kind of decoupling itself from particularly the intellectual, cultural world in that way. I mean, you mentioned my books. Every one of my books was translated into mainland China until this last one. Before that, they would often ask for, edits. There's a few paragraphs on Mao. They would want to cut those out, and I would wrestle with it. And I came to the conclusion better to have it out there in China, and I would have them append a note saying this book has been specially edited for the Chinese market, with making it clear that this was an abridged version of the book. But that is no longer possible. So you can see a marked closing down of the Chinese system. The second piece that we should not underestimate is China is developing a huge popular culture of its own. So one of the things that I was struck by 10 years ago, this is when China was still very much opening up and liberalizing, was that you'd go to China and you'd talk to people there and you'd realize what we thought of as the biggest rock stars of the world, singers in the world, movie actors, they were unknown in China. The biggest movie music people were all Chinese. They did know some of our very biggest people, Britney Spears or Madonna or Taylor Swift now and people like that. But the vast majority of the entertainment space is now Chinese, and that is happening all over the world. Bollywood movies are 95% of the Indian market now. Korean popular culture is massively popular, not just in Korea and other places. And this is, it's a wonderful phenomenon. You're seeing the rise of the rest, as I call it, the cultural renaissance of these places. Often they're copying a lot of American formats. So there's a Korean version of Friends and a Korean version of Modern Family and things like that, but in their own idiom and speaking their own language and things like that. And in that sense, we are losing a certain kind of cultural power. Look, the United States defined modernity for much of the world. When I was growing up in India, you watched American movies and sitcoms and music to understand what modernity was, because America was the face of modernity. Well, now modernity has many faces. There is a Chinese face to modernity. There's a Korean face to modernity. There is an Australian face, and that's a good thing. We want a society, we want a world in which lots of people are doing well. Our greatest soft power was the image and the strength of our democratic system. That's the one I worry about. I think of people watching American watching What I worry about is that people don't respect the American system of government as being something that at the end of the day, secretly, aspirationally, everybody thinks this is where we should get to. That was very, very much part of every country's DNA. Other than the which has its own path. That we're
not going to get nearly all of our questions. I have questions on Taiwan, on other questions. Let me just close with two quick questions. One, from your perspective, what is one common recommendation you make to the leadership in either or both countries to improve relations going forward?
probably One is the senior officials. I am strongly as Churchill said George then the war. Having actual contact make a big difference.